So variables and loops, what are they and how do they work? That's what we're going to be looking at during this presentation. Now, we'll also include some information about functions. So that's going to be a little bit more for the advanced of you, but variables and loops are understandable for all of you. And if you've got any questions after you've checked this out, please send me some communication. All right. Now, the big drive here is that most of you have been developing your house designs in Minecraft, where you've got to put down a series of blocks. You can pass the task if you just do it block by block, but it takes a long time, and a lot of repetition of the same code fills up a lot of your screen. So by starting to bring in variables and loops, you can shrink the amount of code you've got on your screen, but it can still achieve the same end goal. By starting to bring in variables, you can actually achieve more. So that's what we'll be looking at as we go through this. So I've got the picture here of a bucket, and that is the best way that I can think of describing a variable. It's a special part of your code that stores something. So if you think about having a series of buckets, you could write on them different names in order to identify them, and you could have either a number or you could have a word in there, and there's some other different types of things you can store in buckets. But we'll keep it pretty simple, and we'll be dealing just with numbers at this stage. Now, with a variable, you can take that number out and you can put a different number in. So it will now store a new value. The other cool thing you can do with them is you can do some mathematical operations with them. So you might have a bucket or a variable that's got the value of 5 in it, and you can say, look, whatever that value currently is, let's add another 3. All right, so now your variable stores the value of 8. So it's really common. It's very hard to code without having variables, because there are lots of times where you'll need to have the ability to adjust a value. And we'll look at that a little bit more in the next slide. So the first example we've got here is where you might want to have a certain thing happen a bunch of different times. All right, so this will make more sense by the time we look at the loops section that comes after this. But if you want something to happen 5 times or 10 times or 20 times, you've got to store that somehow. And so variables can be a really good way to do that. You can reference a variable at lots of different points in your code. So if you change what that variable is in one spot at the top of your code, then that'll impact all of your code as you go down every time that that variable gets looked at or used. All right, so it's efficient, and it helps you avoid making mistakes where you've updated one number in one spot of your code, but you've forgotten to update it in another spot. All right, the second example there, it's talking about being able to store and values that change over time. Okay, so there are lots of different times when this will happen, but a really nice, easy, concrete example to think about is playing a platform game where you've got a character that's moving along a platform. Now, that current location of the character has to change, otherwise you can't play that game. So every time that character's in a new spot, they might have started on this part of your screen and they've moved across. You've got to be able to store that somehow. And so that changing value gets stored in what we call variables. And the last example is where you've got some sort of human-computer interaction going on, where there might be some questions being asked and someone's answering them. And every time you've signed up to a service, this sort of thing happens, where it's asking you questions about your name, your age, where you live. Those sorts of things get stored in variables, which can then later on be stored in a database for long-term storage. Okay, so we're now getting on to having some examples that you can code yourself and try out. And so I guess even before fully understanding variables, you can go into Minecraft and copy exactly this code that you can see right here. Now you've got to be careful with the colors. The colors are the indication of which part of your menu that you actually get these commands from. All right, so you can see on here that we've got a chat command, which should be very familiar to you by now, and it's got the question of what is the number. So if someone goes into their chat window and they type in that question with the question mark, it's got to be exact. All right, computers, they're not smart, they've got to have it exactly as you've specified there. Now, as soon as they type that command out, then you can see that the second command is talking about having this secret number to 12. So we're setting it to 12. So when you go into your actual section of your code, or Minecraft, I should say, where it's red, and that's the variable section, you'll see an option about creating a new variable. So if you get to that bit, your variable name would be secret number. and then you'll get some options popping up about how to set it and to use it as an actual variable. So I do want to point out as well that the way I've written that, so whenever you've got one, or I guess more than one word for a variable, the first word always starts with a lowercase, so you can see secret starts with a small s, and the second word, you don't have a space. You can't have a space in a variable, it's got to be all squished together. And the second word and the third word and the fourth word, if it's a really long name variable, all of those extra words always start with an uppercase letter. It makes it a little bit easier to read. So because we can't have spaces, we use this system so that you can still read it as a bit of a sentence. But the shorter the name of the variable, the better. It's got to be descriptive though. So that's why I've used the term secret number. All right, that's what it is. It's going to be holding a value of 12. So our bucket has got secret number written on it. It's got the value of 12 that's stored in it. And then we've sort of covered it up. No one knows what it is unless they read the code. And that's why it's important to be able to code, to understand code. You can look under the hood and you can see what things are and what's happening here. So you're starting to get familiar with that a little bit. So this one is a slight change on your previous secret number example that you used. So you can, again, make this one in your code looking for those different colors in order to try and find where these different sections are. The main thing that's changed is instead of specifying a number of 12, we've got this little pick random 0 to 10. You should be able to find that pretty easily if you look through into in the different options in Minecraft. Now, the way a random number works is every time that section gets called, the computer picks a number. And in this case, we've specified it to be between 0 and 10. So every single time someone types in what is number question mark, the computer is essentially going to tell them a new number every single time. There are some times where it might be the same number, so it might be the number 7, and then it might be the number 7 again. But because it's random, generally based upon probability, that number will fluctuate all over the place. One thing I did forget to say in the last slide, and hopefully you've seen this by now, is that when you actually type in that what is number, the command down the bottom there that says say secret number, that will appear in the upper left-hand side of your screen. So yeah, so if you're looking for it, that's where it should pop up, and it stays there for a little while after you've executed that command. Okay, so loops, what are they? We've shifted on from variables. So hopefully you've got the idea of variables as essentially being buckets where we've got values that we can store in there and we can change. Loops allow us to do the same thing again and again and again. Really, really handy. So if you've got the same command that you want to do multiple times, instead of having to write it out 10 times, you can use a loop, and those few lines of loop code they can be set to repeat whatever's inside the loop 10 times or 20 times or 30 times. So the larger the amount of repeats, the more efficient your code is going to end up being. Now, in Minecraft, we've got a few different types of loops we can use. In the fuller, broader coding world, there are a few extra ones, but we're going to keep it simple and we're going to focus on just the repeats and the for loops at this stage. Now, I've tried to give you a fairly straightforward example here. So in Minecraft, this would be an example of wanting to build a simple row, I guess, of blocks, 7 blocks that it's extending out, and it's going along the x-axis. All right, so if you look closely at the coordinates, the x, y, z for each of these blocks, the second and the third ones are staying the same as 0 the whole time. So you've got, so as far as the second one being your y-axis, it means it's basically going to place the block at your feet because it's not going any higher up. And the z-axis just means that it's not going to be going off at an angle while we're changing just the x. All right, so it wouldn't matter which one of these numbers you changed, but to keep it simple, we're just sticking with the x. So before you go any further, copy this code in just to make sure it works properly. And you've also got to make sure that you're not standing directly next to a big mountain or a hill, because you need to be able to see your row of blocks being spaced out. Okay, now this section of code, even though it may look a little bit weird and a little bit new to you, it's doing exactly the same thing as the previous slide, but with less lines of code. Okay, so we've still got a chat command that's building. So it, I guess, initiates this sequence of events to happen. But instead of having 7 of the place block commands in there, we're using what's called a for loop. Now, the way it works is it says here for index from 0 to 6. So the for loop, that index, it's got its own variable name by default when we first put this in here, okay? So whenever you've got a for loop, the index value always starts off at 0, and it's got here from 0, and it will go up until the value of 6. So it seems at first look, oh, it's going to happen 6 times, but you've got to remember it's actually starting at 0. It's not starting at 1. So because it's starting at 0 and it goes all the way to 6, it means it's actually going to do this 7 times. And that's what mimics the previous section of code that we had. Now, if you look at the place block command, where we've got the x value, we've used that index variable and we've placed that in there. So the first time this loop executes, that index value is 0, and it's going to substitute that in the place command. As soon as we go through the loop the second time, the index value increases to 1. And again, when it next does a place command, this time that index value is going to be represented as 1. And every time it loops through this for loop, that value in index increases by 1. And so we'll end up with exactly the same series of blocks as what we had in the previous slide. Try it out. All right, so that's really important with this stuff. Please try out and build all of these examples as you go through, because that way you can get some experience and play around with it a little bit. Now the last example where we're using a for loop all works fine if you want to start at 0. Now there are going to be probably the vast majority of the time you won't want to start at 0. You'll want to start at something else. So in this example, I've gone back to the before loop type thing that we had going on a couple of slides ago, where I'm saying that we're going to, again, build a row of 7 blocks along the x-axis. But this time, instead of starting at 0 and working our way through to 6, we're going to be starting at 3 and working our way through to 9. So we've got a shift of 3, and we need to see, well, how can we do that? Okay, so the solution, the way that we can do that is that we start bringing some of the variables back into it. All right, now we've seen variables in our for loop where we've automatically created the index value when we've used it. But if you look at this little section of code here, we've got a little bit of a new thing we've thrown in there. So in this case, we've still got the for index from 0 to 6, exactly like we had before. Now, we have to do that because we want it to happen 7 times, all right? We're putting 7 blocks, so we need a loop that'll do something 7 times. We've got the same place command going on as far as the block, but the one thing that's changed is in the x value, we've included a mathematical function here. So every time it goes through, if it's 0 to start off with at the index, all right, that 0 is going to be following through into this purple section on our code, but it also adds 3. So it means the first time it goes through, by the time that place command actually happens, we've added 3 onto it, so the first x value is going to be 3. The second time it goes through that loop, the index value is changed from 0 to 1, and so when it gets to the place command, the x value is actually going to be 1 plus 3, which ends up being 4. All right, so every time it goes through, it's just going to add 3 to whatever that index value is. The maths functions are kind of handy. You can see the little drop down symbol next to the plus. You can change the type of maths function you're using, but in this case, the plus is perfectly fine for us. Now this is another example of a type of loop, but instead of using a for loop, we're going to be using a repeat. You might find this way makes more sense to you, or the for loop makes more sense. So you pick the one that works for you. We're not worrying too much about the particular efficiencies of the different loops. As long as you've got one in there, it's great to see. All right, so again, we've got a chat command. This time we're calling it build2. And I have previously set or created a new variable called pos to stand for position. All right, lowercase p because it's the start of the first word. All right, and it's just one short little version of a word, so there's no uppercase letters in it. The first section of red code, I'm setting my position to be 3 because that's where I want that first block to be placed. And instead of using a for loop that starts at 0, I'm just putting in a repeat. And a repeat's a nice simple version of a loop, and I've told it to do it 7 times. And then I've got my place command. Because I'm not having to use the index, I don't have to do any fancy maths with the purple little section of code that you saw in the last one. I can just put that pos value directly into the X. And then the next line of code, the last bit of red there, you can see that I'm changing my pos value by 1, which means I'm increasing it by 1. If I wanted to decrease it, I could change it by -1, but I don't want to do that for this section of code. So by the time it gets to that bottom red command, it's now completed that loop. It goes back up to the top of the green section again, and now it executes and it goes through and it does that place command again. But this time, when it does it the second time, if you remember that last section of red code, we'd increased our pos value by 1, so it's now 4. And so it's going to place a block at the position of 4, 0, 0. So every time it goes through the repeat, it places a block, then it increases that value by 1, then it goes back through and it does the loop again. And it essentially does exactly the same thing as that previous section of code. So again, put this in, build it, check it out, play with it, all right? See what it does, experiment and get used to it. Okay, so as I've been saying throughout this presentation, please be trying to build this code into Minecraft. All right, you can start up a new code file, you can add it to something you're already doing, it's fine. But because you've got limited space with your coding environment in Minecraft, taking up half the screen, it's probably easier for you to start up a new code file to do this. All right, so try that out. And a good self-test is to try changing some of the values and predict what you think it will happen. Okay, what will happen on your or in your gaming environment when you execute that command. And if you get it wrong, cool, but try to understand why you got it wrong. And if you can't, that's when I come into the equation and you ask for some assistance, and you can send me through your code file and I can try and talk you through it. Okay, so please do that before getting onto the next section. So we've covered a basic introduction to loops and variables. Try to use some of those in your code. It will make your house better. Okay guys, so this section on functions, I would suggest only worrying about this in the next few slides if you've got your heads wrapped around loops and variables. If you still need to go through and do some more work with those, then do that. Functions builds on that. So you can think of a function as almost like a type of loop, because it allows you to do the same thing multiple times, but you can call it from different parts of your code. So it's like you've got this big section of code, there might be some chunks of things which need to happen at multiple times in your code, but with different things happening in between there. And then so what you can do is that you can take that section of code, you can stick it somewhere else in your file, and you can give it some special little, I guess, little headers of code. And that allows you to do what's called a function call, which means that anywhere in your code, you can kind of do a shout out and you can say, right, I'm ready to run this little bit of code now. And your computer will sort of jump up to that section of code, run it, and then return back to where it was. All right, so in the example on the next slide, that'll give you a little bit of context about how that actually works. Okay, so what I've tried to do is give you a really, really simple version of a time when a function could be used. This is not the ideal because there's a bit more complexity going on with it. You'd want to be doing more than just a couple of little repetitions of commands. But if you've got some cases in your code where you are repeating the same sequence, like 2 or 3 or 4 or more commands, it does give you the opportunity to throw that into its own function. So if you look at the code we've got here, we've got quick count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're still dealing with 7 different blocks or types of things we're placing down. There's a bit of fluctuation going on, but there is a repetition of the types of plants that are placed down. So we've got an oak sapling and a birch sapling. So that's the second and the third command that are getting placed down, and it's also the last couple of commands. There is some variety in this one changing. So in this example, I'm not changing the X or the Y. So they're going to be staying at 2 above wherever your player is and 4 off to the side or in front, depending upon how you're orientated. But this time I'm changing the Z. Unfortunately, where this little video is, it's blocking the last little bit, but if you see the pattern, you can see they're all increasing by 1 the whole time. So that last birch sapling would be getting placed at a location of 4, 2, and 10. Okay, now on this slide, I've turned off my camera so that you can see all of the content. This is a section of the code where we have to bounce backwards and forwards. Now, if we start off with the function section on the left-hand side, if you're trying to actually create one of these, what you need to do is in your Minecraft window, in the coding options, there's an option down towards the bottom which is advanced. You need to open that up, and there'll be you'll have the ability to select the function section in there. When you first create it, you'll see an option to create a function. You can give it a name when it pops up, and also it'll give you a bunch of different symbols for what type of variable that you can pass into it as well. Because functions, you don't have to pass in values, but in this case we will, because we've got something that changes every time that function gets called, which is going to be the Z value. Now, on this, because we want it to be a number value, there's a little calculator symbol you need to click, and that will allow that to store a number value. If you just press the letter T, it comes up, it'll only accept text values. So variables can be limited to the type of content they can store. Now, inside that function, you'll see that there are 2 different place commands of those 2 saplings, and we'll go through that when we're looking at how the code actually works later. We'll jump over to the right-hand side now, and you'll see that we've still got the same few commands that are remaining in there that were in the previous example, but we've got a couple of function calls in there now. So we're calling to our saplings. So after that first placing of the block, the green section, we're doing a function call to our sapling, and we're passing it the value of 5, which is, we can call that a parameter. We're passing that through. So we're basically shouting out, we're saying, hey, code, it's time to use our saplings function, and here's the value of 5 to work with. Then it jumps over to the left-hand side, it sees the function, and then it jumps into, well, before it jumps into it, it assigns the value of 5 to the variable Z. So then it jumps inside, you've got 2 place commands, and you can see where on the first one it's using that value of Z, so it'll just substitute that for 5. The second one, it's got a Z plus 1, so that will end up being 6. So that will be the equivalent couple of commands that we saw on the previous slide. Then after it's finished the function, it jumps back to the left-hand side again. It's got a couple of more place commands, so another sapling and another block, and then there's one final sapling call. But this time, instead of passing it the value of 5, we're passing it the value of 9. So jumps back over to the left-hand side. There's our function. It's assigned to Z. It'll give it the value of 9. And this time you've got those final couple of placement commands for saplings. The first one will use that value of 9, and the second one it'll increase it to 10. And once it's done that, it jumps back over to the left-hand side. That's the end of that command. So that part of the coding is done and the computer's happy, it's finished. So my suggestion would be, if you're up for it, try and see if you can figure through some of this stuff yourself. It's a bit tricky, and that's why I've kept it here as being more of an advanced feature. We will chat more about this as an option at the end of the next conference, so I can take you through it, share my screen and show you how to set this stuff up. Otherwise, you can send me some questions if there are particular things you get a bit stuck with. But if you do have questions about any of this content, please make sure you post it onto the actual discussion section, so that way everyone can help out and they can all learn from each other's questions. Okay, good luck guys, and if you can use some of these techniques in your Minecraft house coding, do it. It won't add too much extra work. It's more a case of collecting and removing surplus commands that you don't really need to, not having heaps of repetition, and replacing some bits with loops, replacing some bits with functions. So yeah, see what you can figure out. I'd suggest before you start playing with your code too much, that you make sure you've saved a copy of it, just in case things go a little bit messy for you. It gives you a bit of a safety net, so that way you don't have to pull all your hair out in frustration. Okay, so good luck guys, and yeah, keep me in the loop if you've got any questions.